Chapter 10. Presence in Absentia. Silence had never been so loud. The echoes of her screams rang like tinnitus in the dead air. William lay emotionless on his bed. Upon her passing, he'd wept. Upon her cremation, he'd wept. Upon the spreading of her ashes, he'd wept. As he'd wallowed in the wake of her passing, he'd wept for each of those 7 long days. But now the well was empty. His soul was cold. Her absence thickened the air, strangling him with every breath he tried to take and filling his lungs with grief. His memories of her licked at wounds of their own making, threading scars of guilt and shame through his soul. Sasha entered the room, holding the book that she'd been reading today. It was about the Knights' College. William hadn't seen her read a single fiction book since she'd taken her interest in the Clerics of Bethmael. "William," said Sasha, coming over to his bed and sitting down on the end of it. William didn't look at her, continuing to simply stare absent-mindedly at dust particles. "I'm going to sleep in here with you tonight, okay?" she asked, placing a concerned hand on his leg. William didn't respond. He rolled his eyes around to look at his sister without moving his head. She looked very worried about him. Ordinarily, his big brother instincts would kick in and he'd try to ease her mind, but he was far too immersed in his misery right now. He simply stared at her blankly. Her expression darkened slightly as she raised her eyebrows in concern at her older brother. "Pa says you don't have to go back to work until you're feeling ready for it," she said, clearly hoping that this would make him feel better. Work was the last thing he cared about right now. There was another short silence as William returned to staring at the dust particles. "Hey!" said Sasha, slapping him on his leg. He looked up at her in surprise. "I get that you're hurting, Will, but come on, at least say something," groaned Sasha in frustration. William stared back at her silently for a moment before letting out a deep sigh. "I thought you said it was too weird to sleep in here again," said William, again looking away from her. Sasha took a breath and nodded. "It is," she said earnestly, looking at the wall, her brow furrowing uncomfortably. William shifted his gaze to look up at the wall too. Was she also feeling it? Was the sickening ambience emanating from that room real? "You can feel it too?" asked William, sitting up slightly in the bed as his brain suddenly began to question where his personal grief ended and where Sasha could perceive the vile ambience too. "Aye," she said, her expression darkening again as she stared at the wall. Do you smell it too?" asked Sasha, swallowing nervously. When the horrible odour had begun, he had thought that perhaps it was Anne-Marie. He didn't know how long it took for a body to begin to smell, but it had been 3 days before they'd cremated her. The only problem with this theory was that even now the smell grew stronger. "Something's probably dead in the wall," said William, lying back down. Sasha raised her eyebrow at him questioningly. "In the wall? William, you do realize that partition is solid, right?" asked Sasha, clearly questioning her brother's intelligence. "Of course I do," replied William, frustrated by the question. "You know you don't have to sleep in here either, right?" asked Sasha, again looking at her brother in concern. He furrowed his brow in annoyance. "Go away, would ye?" he asked, turning over onto his side and looking away from her. She let out a frustrated huff. "Fine. Sleep in here alone then. I only wanted to sleep in here because I was worried about you, but you're obviously fine," she said angrily, standing up and storming out of the room. William let out another deep breath and let his eyes close. His sister would never understand. William knew that from the outside looking in, it was weird for him to stay here, especially with that horrible smell becoming worse by the day. What they didn't know was that as long as he slept here, he somehow felt closer to her. He felt like moving rooms would somehow be admitting to something that he wasn't ready to accept, not that he even knew what that was. As thoughts and feelings vibrated through his mind and body, there was one question which stood out above all others. If Anne-Marie was really gone, then why did William still feel like he could feel her presence lingering on the other side of that wall? Tap, tap, tap. William shot up in his bed, looking around the pitch-black room. Had he imagined it? Had he dreamed it? He could have sworn he'd just heard that impossible sound. It suddenly dawned on him how intense that horrible smell had become. After darting around the dark room searchingly, his eyes finally found a focal point where he could just make out a dull glow that was emanating from under his wardrobe doors. At first, he sat perfectly still in his bed. Was it the moonlight playing tricks on his eyes? He swallowed anxiously as he rolled out of his bed and tentatively placed his feet on the floor. Why did he feel so scared all of a sudden? The fear which flowed through his body was almost crippling. All he wanted to do was get back into his bed and hide under the covers, but his curiosity was too strong. He stood up and took his first step towards the wardrobe, keeping his arms crossed anxiously across his chest, lest he somehow walk into something in the dark. He continued taking 3 more tentative steps towards the wardrobe before he was within arm's reach of it. His heart was beating fast in his chest, and he could feel his body shaking with anxiety. He could clearly see that dull light through the cracks of his wardrobe now. He took a deep breath, which did nothing to steady his shaky nerves as he extended his right arm towards the door handle. As his hand grasped it, he took one last nervous breath before pulling it open. Tap, tap, tap. "William!" cried out Sasha suddenly. William yelped in fright as he heard his name, falling backwards from the wardrobe and onto the floor. "William, are you all right?" asked Sasha's voice from the darkness. William sat on the floor, huffing and puffing wildly as he tried to get his bearings as adrenaline coursed through his veins. He suddenly felt a hand on his shoulder, which made him whimper in surprise and grab the hand. "It's just me, William," said Sasha, placing her other hand on him too. "What are you doing?" yelled William, angry that his sister had given him such a fright. Despite saying she wouldn't, apparently she'd slept in here with him after all. "No, what are you doing? Why are you walking around the room in the middle of the night?" asked Sasha in response, her voice quivering. William took a deep breath. He hadn't meant to scare his little sister, but clearly his midnight antics had done just that. The room suddenly filled with light as their mother appeared in the doorway holding a candle. "What in the world are the two of you doing?" asked their mother angrily, squinting at the two of them after clearly having just been woken from her slumber. William stared back at his mother, not sure of what to say. "Ma, William's acting weird," said Sasha, looking over at him in fear. "What?" exclaimed William defensively, shocked by her betrayal. "William," began his mother, closing her eyes and shaking her head. William swallowed nervously. "We've tried to give you time. We've tried to give you space. But this has to stop," yelled his mother angrily. "We understand that you cared about her, but enough is enough. Your pa is struggling to pick up your slack in the stables," shouted his mother, with tears appearing in her eyes. William stared back at his mother in horror. He never wanted to make her cry, and he didn't even really understand how he'd done it. "Enough is enough, William. Can't you see you're scaring your little sister?" asked his mother, nodding towards Sasha, who also had tears in her eyes at this point. Began William, not even knowing where to begin to defend himself from what felt like a very unfair confrontation. No matter how unfair it felt, he could see that his behavior had clearly upset both his mother and his sister. He was going to have to quell his emotions from now on, at least so far as they could see. "I'm sorry," said William, closing his eyes and letting out a sigh. His mother let out a sigh of her own before suddenly sniffing and raising an eyebrow. "Is it just me, or is that smell getting worse?" asked their mother, looking between the two of them. William and Sasha both silently nodded. "Okay. Well, if William wants to sit in here with that stink, then he can, but come on, Sasha, you're sleeping in our room," said his mother, gesturing for Sasha to follow her. "But Ma, I want to stay with Will," cried Sasha. "Come, now," commanded their mother angrily. Sasha nodded obediently, grabbing her blanket and pillow. "Come on, William, let's get you back into bed," said his mother, coming over to his side and helping him up from the floor. She walked him over to his bed and tucked him back in, kissing him on the forehead. "I'm sorry, Ma," said William honestly. "Hush now, sweetheart. It's okay. You're becoming a man now. You've got to start acting like one. You can't be scaring your sister like that. Why don't you try talking more with your pa? I know he's quiet, but if you start the conversation, he'll answer you. He just isn't good at speaking first," said his mother, kissing him on the forehead again. "Aye, Mother. Good night," said William, just wanting the two of them to leave the room at this point. As the candlelight eventually worked its way down the hallway and back out of sight, William's room was plunged back into darkness. He rolled over onto his side and closed his eyes. He'd never intended to make his family worry so much about him. As he lay in bed, questioning what was real and what was a mirage of his grief, he once again drifted off to sleep. Tap, tap, tap. The moment William opened his eyes, he was immediately filled with a type of terror he'd never felt before in his life. There, standing before the open doors of his wardrobe, was Anne-Marie. She was ethereal and emitting a dull glow. Despite the strange form she'd taken, it was unmistakably her. William's first instinct would have been to scream in terror, but the fear which coursed through his body rendered him unable to move a muscle. As he beheld her standing in the middle of his room, he dared not even make a sound. She was staring directly at his bed with an expression of pure hatred on her face. It looked positively unnatural on her. She suddenly flickered, momentarily changing to take her dishevelled form like he'd seen in her sickbed before blinking back to normal. She flickered between the two forms randomly as she stared hatefully at William. As he could feel his heart beating in his throat, William's body simply lay perfectly still. His adolescent mind was frozen in fear, unable to make a decision other than to not make a sound and hope that the threat would somehow pass him by. As he stared back at her in terror, she slowly took a beleaguered step towards his bed. He didn't know what to do. Should he follow his instincts and lay perfectly still, hoping that she hadn't seen him? No, she was staring directly at him. Should he scream and cry out for his parents to come? No, he'd made his mother and his sister cry earlier tonight with these antics. He had promised his mother he'd be a man. He had no idea whether this was a dream, a hallucination, or somehow real. No matter which it was, there was naught his parents could do for him anyway. There was only one option for him. He was going to have to run. But how? She was approaching his bed from the side. If he somehow managed to dive off of the end of his bed, he'd be able to sprint right out the door, but then where to? As Anne-Marie took one more beleaguered step towards his bed, he realized he had to make a choice now. As his willpower finally managed to overwhelm his frozen body, he immediately dived over the end of his bed, throwing his covers to the floor as he scrambled over the foot, slamming his shin against the wood in the process. He had no time to lament over the pain, however, as he yanked open his bedroom door and took off into the living room. He dared not even look over his shoulder as the fear coursing through his body overwhelmed his mind and sent him into a near-psychotic state. He could still see the dull glow emitting from Anne-Marie, casting its light into the living room, so he just kept running all the way to the front door and out onto the road. Once outside, he turned around to look back at his house. Through his bedroom window, he could see Anne-Marie still standing there, staring at him hatefully. What was he to do now? He couldn't stay here. She was still clearly following him. He looked around the town road. It was completely silent. It must have been around 3 or 4 in the morning. There was nobody about in the town except for him, and apparently Anne-Marie. He had no choice but to keep running. As he sprinted down the road away from his house, tears began to fall from his eyes. He stopped by a low wall and grabbed onto it while he caught his breath. Was that really Anne-Marie, or was it some kind of hallucination? Suddenly, a realization hit him, sending goosebumps running down his arms. On her deathbed, he'd promised Anne-Marie that he wouldn't look at her, and then he'd betrayed her in her final moments. Could it be that she was this furious at him? What was she going to do to him if she managed to get her hands on him? He sat on the low wall, sobbing silently in the night as he looked down the road, half expecting her to still be following him. Was this a mere hallucination, or was this apparition real? If it was, then what in the world was he supposed to do about it? Chapter 11. Decimation. As he was shaken awake, William let out a cry of panic, flailing about feebly as he tried to assess his attacker. It didn't take more than a few moments to realize that it was his father, looking over him with a mix of concern and confusion on his face. "What has gotten into you, boy?" asked his father, staring down over him with an eyebrow raised. William looked around to try to get a grasp of where he was, before it all suddenly came rushing back to him. He'd ended up taking cover from the rain in the privy behind his house and slept there last night. He'd resolved to wake up early, considering that the morning light would shine on him, but apparently he'd underestimated both how drained he was and how early of a riser his father was. William stared back at his father, gaping his mouth dumbly while he tried to fathom what kind of excuse he could even come up with for his current situation. His father let out a sigh. "Come on, boy. Get out of there," he said, pulling William up and helping him off the floor. William looked guiltily at his father, who seemed to be saddened by his son's pathetic behavior. "William, your mother is very worried about you," began his father, clearly not knowing how to have an earnest heart-to-heart with his son. I know," responded William quietly. "If she knew you'd slept out here, she'd have a breakdown," said his father sternly, shaking his head. "Aye," responded William guiltily. There was an awkward moment of silence between the two of them. His father was waiting for William to explain himself, but he had no explanation to share. What could he possibly say? He saw Anne-Marie in his room last night? His father would think he was having a childish nightmare at best, or that he'd lost his mind at worst. There was no good in that. There was no real excuse for this strange behavior that his father would even buy. After a moment, his father let out another sigh. "Come on, boy, help me exercise the horses before your ma wakes up and gets breakfast ready," he said, gesturing back towards the stables and turning to lead the way. William nodded obediently, thankful that his father wasn't pushing the matter with him. As the two set off on their morning work, William's heart was filled with angst. He couldn't keep this up any longer, so what was he going to do? If he tried to sleep in the house again tonight, would Anne-Marie be back, or had he seen the last of her? William sat leaning against the stable wall as he took a bite from the dark bread that he and his father were eating for lunch. He looked up uneasily at his father, who was quietly eating while staring down at a logbook of the stable's horses. Was now an opportunity to discuss things? He could tell that his father was concerned about him based on how easy-going he'd been today. His usual discipline had been conspicuously missing, and even in his own work his father had seemed absent-minded. William remembered that his mother had told him he should make the first move if he wants his father to open up, so maybe this was the perfect chance. "Pa, have you ever lost anyone?" asked William, blushing, as the idea of discussing something so sappy with his father made him feel like running out of the stables in embarrassment. His father looked slightly surprised by the question, but sank deep into thought. "Only Ma and Pa," replied his father, taking another bite of his own bread. William nodded understandingly and let a long silence form. "You know, with Anne-Marie, we were closer than, well, closer than I made it seem," stammered William awkwardly. His father raised a surprised eyebrow and nodded understandingly. "I figured as much," replied his father simply. William quietly chewed on his bread as he worked up the courage to approach an even touchier subject. "Pa, about last night," said William, swallowing nervously. At first his father seemed to have his interest piqued before he returned to dully looking down at his bread as he ate. William wasn't sure if he was uninterested or if perhaps he just didn't want to scare Will away from opening up. Either way, he felt like it was okay for him to continue. "I saw her last night," said William bluntly. His father raised his eyebrow and looked at Will quizzically. "Well, I mean, I don't know that it was her, but, well, I don't even know that it was real, but," stammered William, regretting putting himself in the spotlight like this. He knew it was real. He had stared at her through that bedroom window from the road outside. In that moment, he'd known he wasn't dreaming. Even if he knew this, though, explaining it to his father as though it were a fact was not a tactful way to approach such an unusual subject. She were in the room. I think maybe she hates me," said William, shaking his head in dismay. "What makes you think that?" asked his father, assessing him with concern. William felt anxiety rising in his chest. He was really going to have to open up here. "Before she died, she told me that she didn't want me to see her. I promised her that I wouldn't, but on that last day, I looked through the window," began William, fighting back the tears which were aching to be released. "She saw me, Pa, right before she died. She saw me. I betrayed her," said William, clenching his fist tightly. His father raised his eyebrows in surprise as he listened on intently. "Well," said his father, thinking deeply. "That sure explains a lot," he said, turning back to his bread and taking another bite. "What do you mean?" asked William, confused. "No wonder you've been acting up. That's a heavy load you've been carrying there," said his father. William stayed silent and nodded his head. "William, let me say this. She don't hate you," said his father assuredly. His words sent a chill down William's spine as relief flooded over his body. "I saw the way she looked at you. It'd take more than seeing her through a window to change her feelings for your boy," explained his father with a confident nod. William once again fought back tears. Having his father's understanding made William's previous feelings of being all alone slightly dissipate. "It weren't smart what you did, but I'd have done the same if I were in your situation," said his father, deep in thought. William nodded thankfully as his father's words sent relief flowing through every inch of his body. If his father would have done the same, perhaps William's actions hadn't been quite as evil as he'd thought. "As for seeing her at night," began his father. Immediately William felt that angst form again. Was his father going to think he was crazy? Was he going to think he was being childish? Was he going to yell at him for trying to discuss one of the forbidden topics? "My pa used to tell me stories about the Great War," began his father, his expression darkening as he was clearly recalling some disturbing tales. He'd never shared a word of this with William. Perhaps he was waiting for him to be older before he shared any of this. "But what you're going through, it's normal, son. He told me that when me granda lost me, Grandma he'd see her at night too. He'd have all sorts of night terrors, seeing her face and all," explained his father. Again, relief flowed through William. So, this was a normal part of losing somebody? This was part of the grieving process. This information changed everything. William's self-doubt was crumbling by the second. His father finished the last mouthful of his bread. "Come on, boy. Let's get back to work," said his father, clapping his hands together to wipe off the crumbs as he stood from his chair. William shoveled the last of his bread into his mouth and stood obediently. As the two returned to their duties, William found himself smiling for the first time since Anne-Marie had passed. So, this was all normal. She wasn't really there. It was just night terrors. This meant that he could sleep in his bed again tonight safely. Even if she did appear again, it would be totally normal, right? William watched as his sister's candle flickered excitedly on the other side of the room. He had asked her if it was okay for him to use it tonight, and she'd happily obliged him, overjoyed for him to be reading a book for once. Little did she know he was just using it to make himself feel safer. The flickering light brought him comfort, and despite his sister not being in the room with him, it made him feel like she was. He closed his eyes and tried to calm his racing mind down. Tonight was a night just like any other. He tried his hardest not to think about Anne-Marie, but every time he tried to force himself to think of something else, she immediately came bursting back into his mind. He couldn't unsee that terrifying gaze of fury which had plastered her ethereal face last night. Was his father right? Was she really not angry with him? Was seeing her really a normal part of losing a loved one? Either way, he was going to have to toughen up and just try to sleep here. He thought about his father. There is no way he could imagine his father worrying like this over something so silly. There is nothing scary enough that'd make him run around the streets crying at night before going to sleep in a privy. As William lay in bed chastising himself for his immaturity, his mind finally let go and allowed him to drift into a deep slumber. Tap, tap, tap. The moment that William opened his eyes, he was immediately thrown into a panic. Anne-Marie was standing directly over him this time. She was standing right by the side of his bed, reaching out towards him with a dark and deep loathing in her eyes. He had no time to even scream, jerking away from her and smacking the back of his head on the wall beside his bed as he escaped her grasp. He threw his covers aside and jumped over the end of the bed backwards, not wanting to take his eyes off of her. Her expression darkened as she watched him escape her grasp, suddenly letting out a hurricane of furious, unintelligible words, which William heard as but a whisper. He didn't recognize the voice which reverberated through his soul and sent chills down every appendage. Despite not understanding them, the fear and dread that the incomprehensible words sent through his very spirit caused his legs to shake and give way. He collapsed to the floor in terror as the voice echoed in his mind. He felt warmth spread through his loins as he lost control of his bladder, the fear that this strange voice invoked overwhelming his mind and body. As he sat in a puddle of his own making, Anne-Marie glided her way around the bed towards him, the approaching threat finally kicking him back into gear. He regained control of his shaking legs and managed to scramble to his feet, once again bolting through the sitting room and out the front door of his house. Once he was outside on the rainy street, he looked back through the window of his room and saw Anne-Marie standing on the other side, looking utterly furious. Her hair flowed strangely in the air behind her as she stared at him with the deepest hate he'd ever felt from anybody in his life. The killing intent which oozed from her clung to his heart and sucked every ounce of happiness and joy that he had left. William once again fell to his knees as his legs gave out. Tears streamed down his face as he cried in fear and confusion. Anne-Marie suddenly looked away from William, turning her head to look directly at the wall between his bedroom and the living room. William sat up slightly, confused about what had drawn her attention away. Up until now, she had always been entirely focused on him. A few moments later, a dull glow radiated from the front door of his house as his father appeared in the doorway holding a candle. "William!" he called out, staring at his son who was sitting on the road outside of their house in the rain in the middle of the night. Before William could respond, Anne-Marie suddenly started to glide straight towards his father and out of view from the window. "Pa! Pa! Watch out!" cried out William, struggling to regain control of his shaking legs as he scrambled to his feet on the wet, earthy road. His father lowered his candle slightly, trying to get a better look at William. At this moment, William saw Anne-Marie appear directly behind his father. "Behind you!" yelled William, pointing towards Anne-Marie, who was now floating directly towards him with her arms extended menacingly. His father turned around and adorned an expression of shock, but he was too slow. Her hands connected with his neck and immediately began to strangle him. "Father!" cried out William, not sure of what he could possibly do to help him. He stood out on the street, frozen on the spot, fear gluing him to the patch of earth he was standing on as he watched his father gasping for breath. Before William's very eyes, his father fell to his knees, clutching his throat and gagging desperately. He stared at William with an expression of fear that he'd never seen on his father's face before in his life. The dramatic moment kicked William back into gear. He finally began to take back control of his body as he took a few steps towards the door, but at that very moment it suddenly slammed shut as if on its own accord. William ran to the door, pulling at it frantically as he tried to get inside, but it was locked shut. He banged on it desperately, screaming for somebody to let him in. At that very moment, he heard a sound that shook him to his very core. His mother and his sister were screaming from deeper in the house. There was no time to lose. William had to do something to help them. He looked around desperately for something to ram the door with, but there was nothing he could use. There was only one option left for him. He ran around to the stables and grabbed his shovel before bolting his way around to his bedroom window. He had no time to waste, as he smashed straight through the locked window with his shovel, sending glass hailing into his bedroom. He hurriedly climbed through the smashed window and fell roughly onto his bedroom floor, cutting his hands and legs up as he climbed over the fractured glass. With no time to tend to his wounds, he ran around to his parents' room, immediately beholding a sight which would haunt him until the end of his days. William's father sat over his mother, who was lying on the floor. He had his hands gripped around her neck and was squeezing as hard as he could. Her face was beginning to turn bright red as she helplessly gasped for breath beneath the gigantic man. His sister was in the corner with a red cheek from clearly having been struck hard. She was cowering in fear and screaming in horror as she helplessly watched on while her father strangled her mother to death before her very eyes. When William entered the room, his father snapped his head around to stare directly at him. His head jerked around for a moment as he seemed to be fighting with himself, before suddenly he made direct eye contact with William. "Kill me, boy!" demanded his father desperately. William watched on in shock, not sure of what to do. His mother's desperate punches at his father were beginning to falter as she lost consciousness. "What?" whimpered William, stunned. "It's inside of me! Do it now, boy! Kill me!" demanded his father again, tears streaking down his face as he could clearly feel his wife's life leaving her body through his hands. "Stop him!" cried out Sasha suddenly, pulling William out of his stunned paralysis. He had to stop his father at all costs. He ran towards him and smacked him across the head with his shovel, but to the giant man this was nothing but a dull blow. "Harder!" pleaded his father desperately. William took a deep breath before instinct finally overwhelmed him. He picked the shovel up in two hands and struck downwards at the side of his father's head, like he was chipping at a boulder. Despite the brutal blow, he kept his tight grip around his wife's throat. William screamed in horror as he finally fathomed the reality of what it was going to take to end this. "More!" exclaimed his father desperately. William continued screaming in despair as he released a hail of strikes to his father's head, cracking his skull with the end of his shovel over and over again. His sister wailed in misery in the corner as she watched her father's skull be caved in and dismantled by William's brutal blows. William continued to scream in horror as he splattered the floor of his parents' bedroom with his father's blood. Finally, his father's grip around his mother's throat released as he fell to the floor. William stopped, the shovel raised in the air above his head, ready to release another strike if he needed to. He looked at his mother's lifeless corpse. her face frozen in a countenance of terror. Kill me," gurgled his father before releasing a terrible death rattle. A sickening silence filled the room, broken only by William's panting, as he and Sasha stared hopelessly at the ever-growing pool of blood and gore beneath their parents' corpses. "Pa? Ma?" stammered William, his young mind broken by the impossible scenario which had just taken place. Sasha suddenly released a cry of horror as she too processed the impossible situation. As she screamed, William let go of his shovel, which clattered to the floor. His arms were shaking with shock and adrenaline as he caught himself in a futile embrace while he stared perplexed at his parents' corpses. William turned towards his little sister and took a few steps towards her, wanting to comfort her but causing her to retreat from him in fear. "Sasha, I had to," said William, unsure even himself of whether this was true. She stared back at him, with fear and confusion plastering her face as she stared at her own brother like he was a wild animal. Suddenly, her gaze shifted over his shoulder, and as it did, her expression changed to one of pure terror. William turned his head and felt his heart drop as he realized what she'd seen. There, rising from the corpses of their parents, was Anne-Marie, but this time she looked different. She no longer looked dishevelled and weak. She no longer was flickering between her broken, sickly body and her white, night-gowned, ethereal version. As she slowly rose from his father's corpse, it was as though she was formed entirely of shadow. She still wore her white nightgown, but her hair was now a deep jet black, and her fingers ended with dark claws at least a foot long each. Her eyes were glowing a deep red, and a tangled web of shadowy tendrils extended all around her like wings. This time, William wasn't going to let himself be stunned by fear. He immediately snapped into action. He lunged towards Sasha, grabbing her and pulling her towards him. She screamed in panic, but he didn't care how hard she fought against him. He had to get her to safety. He threw her over his shoulder and ran out the door without taking a second look at the monster, which was still emerging from his father's body. As they ran, she stopped fighting him and simply clung to him for support. William carried her straight to the front door of the house, unlocking it and bursting through it in one quick motion before running around to the stables. He quickly readied Bonnie, leading her out of the stables and leaping up onto her bare back, pulling his sister up with him. Sasha continued to cling to his chest, hugging him tightly as she faced backwards on the horse. Just as he managed to climb his way up, the front door of his house burst open, blasted from its very hinges. It exploded out onto the street, revealing the dark, shadowy monster standing directly behind it. William didn't waste a second. He kicked his horse into action, getting it into a gallop as quickly as he could while he held his sister tightly. As the two of them rode off into the stormy night, Sasha screamed over his shoulder. William looked back and saw the monster leaving their house and heading into the road. It began floating through the air, clearly following them. William kicked his horse again, spurring it to run as fast as it could. He didn't even know where he was going. All he knew was that they had to keep running. The thunderstorm above intensified as the two bolted their way through the night and out of the village. William had no time to question what had happened in that house. He had to get his sister to safety, but where even was safety? The only place he could think of was his uncle's house. It was a fair way out of town, and if Anne-Marie was following William, perhaps he could drop his sister off there before leading the monster out of town and into the night. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was the best he could come up with on the spur of the moment. Bonnie raced through the night, clearly also sensing the dark entity which was pursuing them and achieving speeds neither William nor his father had ever managed to rouse in the beast. Within a matter of minutes, they'd made it to their uncle and aunt's house. As soon as they neared the front doors, William reared Bonnie and lowered Sasha down, but she refused to let go of him. "Sasha, please, you have to get down. Go to Uncle Wilton. He and Aunt Genevieve can keep you safe," pleaded William, looking over his shoulder as he knew that the monster was approaching. "No!" exclaimed Sasha, tears streaming down her face as she realized what her brother's plan was. "Sasha, please! She's after me, not you! If I can lead her away from town, you'll be safe. Please, you have to go now. I can't lose you too," cried William desperately. Sasha pressed her face into his chest, bawling her eyes out as the reality of the situation hit her. William hugged her tightly and kissed the top of her head. "Sasha, please, if you don't go now, it's going to hurt them too," said William softly. His sister continued hugging him for a few moments longer before her grip loosened. She pulled back and looked into his eyes to assess his expression. "Promise me you'll come back," said Sasha, her face plastered with fear and desperation. William brushed her wet hair out of her eyes and smiled back at her. I promise. We have to hurry now," said William, finally letting go of her. He dashed into his uncle's horse shed and stole his saddle. With what lay ahead of him, William knew that he wasn't going to be able to pull it off bareback. He hurriedly attached it to Bonnie before hopping back up and watching Sasha retreating towards his uncle and aunt's house. He turned his horse around to face back towards the storm and took a deep breath. This chase was only just beginning. Over the horizon, he could see the eye of the storm approaching. It was only at this moment that he realized that it was coming straight towards him, as though it was somehow following Anne-Marie. William had no time to question it. He kicked his horse back into action. He needed to make sure he had Anne-Marie's attention. For him to do that, he was going to have to gallop back towards it and lead it out of town. He took a deep breath before setting off. This might be the stupidest thing he would ever do, but for Sasha's sake, he had to make sure that it was following him and not her. Chapter 12. Storm Chasing. The closer that William's horse carried him towards Anne-Marie, the more intense the storm became. Just as he didn't think it could get much worse, he finally saw the silhouette of Anne-Marie on the horizon. There she was, with her cape of black tendrils flowing outwards in all directions. Never before had William felt such a deep and threatening aura of fear and destruction as the monster before him was producing. Bonnie clearly felt it too, as she reared up, whinnying and drawing to a halt. "Whoa, girl," said William shakily as he tried to steady his own nerves. Nothing mattered right now except making sure this thing didn't go anywhere near Sasha. As Anne-Marie drew closer, her form became clearer and clearer. The intense lightning which was swelling in the clouds above lit up the countryside enough for William to clearly see her. He'd heard horror stories throughout his life about the monsters that came out of that gateway, but even they paled in comparison to seeing this apparition with his very own 2 eyes. She was flying through the wilderness several feet above the ground. A dark cloud of chaotic energy spiraled around her as she flew towards him. Even from this distance, William could make out those horrific, glowing red eyes. It was time for him to run. Once again, William reared his terrified horse up, turning her away from Anne-Marie and towards the road out of town, leading down into the moorlands. As long as it followed him now, he could make sure that Sasha was safe. The monster had clearly seen him as it released a shriek of rage and malice which echoed over the landscape, joined by several lightning bolts which demolished trees all around him. William had no time to spare. He kicked his horse back into a gallop, clinging low to her and bolting through the night. Each time he looked back, he felt the terror reignited in his heart. She was definitely following him, flying through the air towards him like she was the embodiment of Malice itself. As William approached the road out of town, he closed his eyes for a moment. Here it was. This was the moment that would decide everything for him. Would she follow him, or would she veer off towards Sasha in the farmstead up the hill? He crossed his fingers, hoping with all his might that his plan would work. As Bonnie tore down the road, he took one last look over his shoulder. Anne-Marie was approaching the fork in the road. Would she take the road up the hill towards Sasha, or take his bait and follow him down into the moorlands? As William galloped on in anxious anticipation, he took one final look over his shoulder. It worked. Anne-Marie was still following him at top speed. "Yes!" exclaimed William happily, so filled with relief that he somehow released a triumphant huff even in this horrific scenario. "Here!" William kicked Bonnie into the fastest gallop that she could manage on the difficult mountain path. She didn't need any convincing. She too could clearly feel the presence of that monster encroaching behind them and wanted nothing more than to run away as fast as she could. Now that he knew that it was following him, William didn't have to hold back at all. His horse flew down the mountain fast enough that the rain flying into his face stung like hornets. He didn't care about the discomfort. All he wanted to do was create as much distance between him and Anne-Marie as he could. As images of his dead parents penetrated his broken mind again, he had to shake his head and quell them for now. He had no time to lament, not yet. He still didn't even have a plan, but he did at least have a destination in mind. There was only one place that he'd ever been to in the moorlands: Eric's farm. He'd been so wrapped up in his own grief that he hadn't even found out whether Eric had made it back from Mistfall, but at this point he was out of options. He was going to have to take the gamble that Eric would be home. He had no other choice. He hated to bring this otherworldly horror to Eric's doorstep, but he couldn't do this alone. After close to 20 minutes of artfully navigating their way down the muddy and rocky mountain path, William and Bonnie finally burst their way into the open moorlands. As soon as Bonnie noticed the even ground beneath her hooves, she finally let herself go, breaking into a ferocious gallop down the straight moorland road. With the flat ground beneath them, they were finally able to put some real distance between themselves and Anne-Marie. William looked over his shoulder, the black storm swirling down the mountain with bright flashes of lightning erupting within it. Anne-Marie was still coming, and it seemed that she would stop at nothing to catch him. He turned back to the road ahead and narrowed his eyes nervously. The moorland fog made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead of them. If there were any obstructions on the road, both he and his horse would be sent flying without any recourse to stop themselves. He placed his hand gently on the side of her neck. The poor thing was utterly exhausted. William knew her limits. He'd been taking Bonnie out for exercise for months now. "Come on, girl. Not much longer," said William gently, as he felt Bonnie's pace slowing. Thankfully, when Eric's great-grandfather had moved down into the moorlands, he hadn't gone too far from Lac Dorian. Within 15 minutes, William began to see some familiar farmlands that indicated that they were nearing the Rothmain estate. As they continued through the mist, he suddenly spotted the entrance way into their land. "There it is! This way, girl!" exclaimed William, again gently patting his horse on the side of her neck as he turned her off from the main road and into Eric's farm. It would only be a couple of hours until sunrise, but as William strained to see through the mist at the encroaching storm, he knew that it wouldn't take that long for Anne-Marie to catch up. As soon as they approached the dooryard of the farmstead, William jumped from his horse, leading her over to a full drinking trough where she began replenishing herself. He didn't have a second more to waste, bolting directly to Eric's front door and banging on it desperately. "Eric! Eric! Let me in!" cried out William frantically, pounding at the door with his fist as he looked over his shoulder in the direction of the oncoming storm. It didn't take long before William heard Eric's familiar voice on the other side of the door. "Who goes there? I have a weapon!" he yelled threateningly. "Eric, it's me, William! Open up, please!" William yelled desperately back through the door. The door was hurriedly unlatched and swung open, revealing Eric standing there holding a butcher's knife. As soon as William set eyes on him, a tsunami of emotions ran over him. His body finally gave itself permission to buckle under the tremendous trauma it had endured. His legs gave way and he collapsed into Eric, catching him in a tight embrace. He released a cascade of tears into Eric's shoulder, finally not alone in facing this terrifying experience. "William! What's the matter with you?" asked Eric, pulling away to inspect him in more detail. William didn't know how to respond. Where could he even start? A deep, booming thunder suddenly growled over the countryside, snapping William back to reality. He jolted his head around and stared at the oncoming storm. Judging by the way the storm was churning up the mists, it looked like Anne-Marie had almost reached the moorlands. William shook his head and took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "Eric, I don't have a lot of time to explain," stammered William, the hopelessness of the situation suddenly re-entering his psyche as he tried to piece together how he could even begin to form a coherent recount of the night's events. "It's okay, William. Take a deep breath. I still have some of that fancy tea that the travelling merchant brought through from the desert the other day. Let me put on a pot and—" began Eric. "No!" exclaimed William, again shaking his head to try to steady himself. He began slapping his cheeks to bring himself back into a more useful state of mind. "There's no time for that," cried William. Eric nodded understandingly. "Okay, come on then. Tell me what's happening, or I won't be able to help you," coaxed Eric calmly. William nodded, taking one final deep breath to steady himself. "Okay, so, Anne-Marie, she's dead," said William. "Oh, no! I'd heard that she was pregnant, but—" began Eric, sorrow plastering his face. But William shook his head, trying to figure out how to phrase it all. "Something is wrong, Eric. When she died, something was left behind, something really bad," said William, a chill running down his spine as he tried to explain himself. Eric's expression darkened as he listened to his friend's story. "It's like her, but it's not. It's something else. It took control of my power and it... William couldn't hold it back any longer. Images of his father's skull splattering the floor at the end of his own shovel while his mother was choked to death flashed back into his psyche. He pulled back from Eric, turning into the garden bed and dry retching. "William!" exclaimed Eric, squatting down beside him and putting a concerned hand on his back. William convulsed and shook as he tried feebly to regain his composure. "What do you mean it took control of him?" asked Eric in confusion, his eyes only now settling on the blood which smattered William's wet clothes. "I don't know," screamed William, tears again erupting from his eyes. "It went inside of him, and it made him... William couldn't even say the words. He shook his head. "Look, it doesn't matter. All that matters is that storm," began William, pointing through the mist towards the storm which was ever encroaching. "It ain't natural," continued William, shaking his head. "Aye," agreed Eric, looking up at it broodingly. "She's in the centre of it, and she's coming here." "Right, now," said William chillingly. He watched as Eric fathomed the urgency of the situation. "What can we do then?" asked Eric. William thanked his lucky stars that his best friend was ready to believe his story without question. If Eric hadn't believed him, William wasn't sure what he was going to do. Even still, all William could do was stare back at him blankly. Understanding crossed Eric's face as he clearly realized that William was in over his head. His plan had ended at getting to Eric's farm. "It's okay, William. We'll think of something," said Eric, patting William on the shoulder before standing up and adorning his expression of deep thought. With Eric on his side, maybe, just maybe, they'd be able to figure out a way to get out of this alive. Eric extended a hand to help William up, which he accepted gratefully. "You think that this thing wants to get inside of you, right?" Like it did your pa? Asked Eric. William nodded back. It tried to do it while I was asleep, but I managed to get away, said William, shuddering as he remembered waking up to Anne-Marie standing over him. Eric nodded again. In all of Granda's journals, I've never heard of anything quite like that, I'm sorry to say, admitted Eric, shaking his head. William nodded understandingly. He'd never heard of anything like it either. But, began Eric, immediately rousing William's spirits with hope. My Granda, he talked about his shield, said Eric, deep in thought. In his journal, he talked about a sigil he painted on his shield. He said that as long as his shield had that sigil painted on it, monsters from the gateway couldn't break through it, he continued. Monsters from the gateway? Asked William in surprise. It's got to be, right? Have you ever heard of something like that coming from anywhere else? Asked Eric. William stared back at him blankly. How would a monster from the gateway have made it into Lacdorian? Wait a minute, breathed William, taking a step back from Eric as realization hit him. You don't think it was Father Marcus who did this, do you? Asked William, his eyes widening in realization. Eric nodded solemnly. We could tell that there was something wrong with him, right? Maybe he brought it with him from the gate. Maybe it transferred from him into Anne-Marie somehow, guessed Eric. William placed a hand over his forehead as realization struck him. So they might be dealing with one of the denizens of the other world here after all. How had a bunch of peasants had the misfortune to be on the receiving end of something so horrific? William, stay with me now, implored Eric, looking up at the encroaching storm. If that sigil works on shields, what if it works on other things? Asked Eric cryptically. William raised an eyebrow, unsure of what Eric was getting at, before it finally sank in. What if we could paint it on me? Asked William, causing Eric to snap his head around to stare at him. No, brother. The paint could just wash away, and I don't have any pigments in our farm right now anyway, said Eric, shaking his head assuredly. What about a tattoo? Asked William, feeling like this idea of applying the mark directly to his body was their best bet. Eric thought about it for a moment, and then shook his head. Do you know how to tattoo? I certainly don't. I don't even have the tools required for that, or the know-how. Plus, we've not the time, said Eric decisively. William let out a groan of frustration. Was there nothing that they could do here? Suddenly Eric's eyes lit up with realization. William, I've got it, said Eric, clapping his hands together excitedly. A brand! We brand our cattle. I can make a brand of that symbol and we can, began Eric, suddenly recoiling slightly as he imagined trying to brand it into William's flesh. William grabbed Eric by his shoulders and stared into his eyes seriously. Eric, I can handle it. This is it. This is the plan. So, what is this symbol? Asked William. Eric looked at William with uncertainty on his face for a moment, but when he saw the determination in William's eyes, he nodded in agreement. Eric suddenly moved past Will and began to run down the garden path, beckoning for William to follow him. William hurried after him eagerly to a nearby garden shed. Eric immediately pulled out a shovel and threw it to William, who was hit with a wave of disgust as he remembered the last thing he'd done with a shovel. Eric then appeared back at the door of the shed with a shovel of his own. "What's this supposed to be for?" groaned William, not having wanted to hold a shovel ever again in his life. "I told you that the sigil was on my great-granddad's shield, right?" asked Eric. William nodded in confusion. "Well, he was buried with it," said Eric seriously. William was lost for a moment before realization hit him and he let out a groan. How was this night still getting worse? As the two boys got ready to set off into the farmland, the rain from the storm finally began to reach them. Would they really be able to do all of this on time? Even if they did, would it really work?